Me father do keep fat oxen and sheep, and a neat little nag on the downs. In the middle of the night when the moon do shine bright, there's a number of work to be done, me brave boys. There's a number of work to be done.
In the year 1776, the United States declared independence from Great Britain and then almost lost the war. The American army was expelled from Canada with heavy losses, and only the onset of winter prevented the British from attacking the American stronghold at Ticonderoga. George Washington's army suffered a series of decisive defeats. After losing more than 20% of his army at the Battle of Long Island, Washington lost New York City, the Battle of White Plains, and Fort Washington with its garrison of 3,000 men and huge quantities of weapons and materiel. What was left of Washington's army was chased all the way across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. By autumn, only a quarter of those who had started the campaign remained. The relatively minor victories at Trenton and Princeton ensured the survival of Washington's command throughout the winter. But the British had every reason to believe that, North and South, 1777 would all but put an end to the rebellion. March 1777, two deserters from the rebel country arrived in Montreal and informed me that my property had been seized, confiscated, and that Mrs. Peters and the children had been sent off in a sleigh with one bed by Jacob Bailey to Ticonderoga, 140 miles through the woods, snowstorms and bad roads. General Gage sent them 80 miles on their way to Canada and left them with 3 weeks' provisions in a deserted house. Here she stayed 18 days with our children only, the oldest being 14 years. At length, a British scout discovered and carried them to Montreal. As the weather warmed, General John Burgoyne led a large British army south on Lake Champlain. They hoped to capture Ticonderoga and then advance to Albany, where they would meet another army moving north from New York City. This would cut off New England from the rest of the United States and would be a major stepping stone toward British victory in the conflict. The 8,000 British, Hessian, and Brunswicker troops outnumbered the Continental forces facing them by more than 2 to 1. Burgoyne's troops landed at the southern end of the lake and advanced on Mount Independence and Fort Ticonderoga. On July 2nd, the leading elements of General Simon Fraser's advance guard ran into part of Seth Warner's regiment. In a sharp skirmish beyond the American lines, Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler and several others were killed. On the British side, Lieutenant Richard Houghton was wounded. He would recover and would have a long military career in the Green Mountains. After 2 more days of probing the fortifications, the British hauled artillery up the undefended Mount Defiance. Their guns completely dominated the American positions, and the American commanders realized that they would soon be cut off. They decided to evacuate Ticonderoga and Mount Independence under cover of darkness. At dawn, Fraser's advance guard followed in pursuit. The American soldiers were dumbfounded when the orders came to pull out. Many had spent more than a year turning Ticonderoga into the premier defensive position on the continent and thought there was no better place to face their enemies. As they began a long and grueling march away from Mount Independence, morale plummeted. After a grueling 24 miles, they stopped to rest for the night. The rear guard camped at Hubbardton, Vermont, and that's where the British caught up with them on the morning of July 7th. The American rear guard included Warner's regiment, the 2nd New Hampshire, and the reinforced 11th Massachusetts, all under Seth Warner's command. They were encamped along the Castletown Road, with a screen of troops posted along Sucker Brook. Hundreds of sick and infirm stragglers encamped behind the forward screen. Warner's effective force numbered 950 men. General Simon Fraser's advanced guard had a total strength of 850, but they were the cream of Burgoyne's army. Fraser had with him a battalion of light infantry, a battalion of grenadiers, 2 companies of the 24th Foot, and a party of scouts. They rose early and renewed the pursuit in darkness. Warner planned to continue his retreat around 7 o'clock. When General Fraser came up on the American rear guard, he hesitated. Hessian and Brunswicker troops were marching to join Fraser, and he thought of waiting for their arrival to launch an attack. But Major Grant of the 24th Foot argued that the tired and demoralized American force would surely run away if given a push. At dawn, the light infantry attacked the American line along Sucker Brook. The firing instantly began. Every man was trying to secure himself behind girdled trees. I made shelter for myself and discharged my piece. Having loaded again and taken aim, my piece missed fire. I brought the same a second time to my face, but before I had time to discharge it, I received a musket ball in the small of my back and fell with my gun cocked. My uncle, Daniel Foster, and another man laid me down behind a large tree, where was another man crying out most bitterly with a grievous wound. The enemy pursued our men in great haste. The Americans fell back within a matter of minutes, but the British suffered dozens of casualties. Among those killed was Major Grant.
Upon his coming up with the enemy, he got upon the stump of a tree to reconnoiter, and had hardly given the men orders to fire when he was struck by a ball, fell off the tree, and never uttered another syllable.
The light infantry pressed their advantage and met the rest of the American force formed on the road to Castleton and just beginning to march away. When the British forces suddenly appeared, Warner's whole line faced to the right and attacked.
I was at the head of the light infantry battalion, and it had a pretty steep hill on the left flank. I halted the light infantry, faced them to the left, and with the whole in front I ran up the hill with them, and we met the rebels endeavoring to get possession of it.
The New Hampshire and Massachusetts regiments fought with the British light infantry over control of the hill. Warner's regiment faced the 24th Foot and worked around their flank. Fraser committed his grenadiers, and, now outnumbered 2-1, Warner's regiment slowly gave ground.
They continued retreating from one post to another, the country affording them many.
Warner's men stopped several bayonet charges with heavy musketry, and Major John Ackland, commanding the grenadiers, received a musket ball through his thigh. The New Hampshire and Massachusetts men fell back to a high log fence along the Castletown Road. The light infantry attacked the fence, but were driven back by heavy fire. They reformed and tried again.
We drove them back twice by cutting them down so fast. We fought till I had fired nearly 20 cartridges.
When the British assaults were bloodily repulsed, the New Hampshire troops crossed the road and attacked the British left flank. The companies struck by this assault were shot to pieces. The light company of the 34th Regiment sustained casualties approaching 70%.
Lord Balcarres, who commands the light infantry, had near 30 balls shot through his jacket and trousers, and yet only received a small graze on the hip. Lieutenant Douglas, of the 29th Regiment, as he was carried off the field wounded, received a ball directly through his heart.
Fraser could see that his force was about to be destroyed, and sent messengers galloping off in search of the Hessians.
At last we arrived on an eminence from which we could see the contending forces. I saw at a glance that the Americans were moving more and more towards their right, with the evident intention of surrounding Fraser's left wing. I therefore resolved to outmaneuver them and get into the enemy's rear. At this moment, an aide arrived with a message from Fraser to the effect that he feared his left wing would be surrounded. I sent word to him that I was at that very instant about to attack the enemy's right wing.
After 90 minutes of battle, both the British and the Americans were tired and running low on ammunition. The arrival of fresh Hessian troops with full cartridge boxes completely tipped the scale. The 2nd New Hampshire fell into disarray. Colonel Francis, commander of the 11th Massachusetts, was killed. Warner saw it was time to disengage. But the Grenadiers had gained control of the road heading south. As the American forces retreated into the woods and over Pittsford Ridge, the firing died away.
The conflict once over, the mind returns to its proper sense of feeling, and deeply must its sensibility be wounded when the eye glances over the field of slaughter, where so many brave fellows, who a few hours before were high in spirits and full of the vigor of life, are laid low in the dust, and the ear continually pierced with the deep sighs and groans of the wounded and dying.
The Battle of Hubbardton was the 16th bloodiest battle of the Revolutionary War. 208 British and Hessian soldiers were killed or wounded. The Americans sustained 371 casualties, but most of those were captured, many of them among the stragglers camped near Sucker Brook when the battle began. The American rear guard inflicted over 20% casualties on the shock troops of the British Army and stopped their pursuit in its tracks. The main Continental Army camped just north of Albany, and Warner's regiment withdrew to Manchester, Vermont. As Burgoyne concentrated his forces at the southern end of Lake Champlain, he ordered 2,000 Hessian and Brunswicker troops to Castleton. For 2 weeks, they protected the British flank and attempted to pacify the countryside. Vermonters faced difficult choices. Patriots and Loyalists actively supported one cause or the other by taking up arms, providing supplies, and harboring scouts and spies. Protectioners were those whose political views were overwhelmed by their desire to live peaceably, or who thought it best to wait and see which side would gain the ascendancy before declaring their allegiance. Each would suffer in their turn. The Vermont authorities urged patriots in the path of British forces to destroy their crops, leave their farms, and bring their livestock with them to prevent them falling into enemy hands. Remaining on their land as the British Army arrived cast a shadow of suspicion onto the owner. The Hessian and Brunswicker troops in Castleton invited locals to come and make an oath of loyalty to the king.
About 400 inhabitants from different townships came into Castletown and took the oath of allegiance in due form, each one receiving a certificate to that effect. A large number of these people were not earnest in taking this oath. They had only come that they might find out the names of those who were truly loyal and afterwards betray them. No sooner had Colonel Warner heard the report of these spies than he at once advanced, plundered the Loyalists, took away their cattle, and even carried off the men themselves.
Warner sent patrols north from Manchester to watch the enemy forces at Castleton. They skirmished with enemy units at Teignmouth and fanned out looking for supplies. Lieutenant Thomas Lyon led his detachment to Arlington to collect cattle from the number of Loyalists living there, and ran into Dr. Samuel Adams and his newly formed company of Loyalist Rangers. Private David Mallory of Warner's regiment had studied medicine under Adams before the war, and as Mallory drove the cattle out of town, Adams shot him dead. He and his Rangers fled to Burgoyne's army. Loyalist militia joined Burgoyne's army by the hundreds, conducted scouts and raids in western Vermont, and clashed with Patriot militia at Moncton. General Riedesel wanted to move south and occupy Manchester, but Burgoyne was concentrating his forces for the move toward Albany. As the British advanced, their supply lines stretched, and progress slowed to a crawl. Burgoyne devised a plan to send a lightning raid through Vermont to the Connecticut River, gathering food, horses, and Loyalist recruits along the way. Thus supplied, Burgoyne could attack the main American army and capture Albany. The mission was given to Colonel Friedrich Baum with a 720-man force comprised of Brunswicker dragoons, 2 cannon, native warriors, and a contingent of Loyalists that included Colonel John Peters' regiment.
The object of your expedition is to try the affections of the country, to disconcert the counsels of the enemy, to mount the Riedesels dragoons, to complete Peters' corps of Loyalists, and to obtain large supplies of cattle, horses, and carriages. It may perhaps be advisable to tax the several districts with their proportions of the several articles, and limit the hours for their delivery. And should you find it necessary to move before such delivery can be made, hostages of the most respectable people should be taken to secure their following you the ensuing day. All persons acting in committees or any offices under the directions of Congress, either civil or military, are to be made prisoners.
Their first objective was the supply depot at Bennington. General John Stark was a prickly character. He'd been prominent in Rogers' Rangers during the French and Indian War, and commanded a brigade in Washington's army until, angry at being passed over for promotion, he returned to his home in New Hampshire. New Hampshire raised a brigade of militia, and Stark agreed to the independent command. Stark's 2,000 men arrived in Bennington just before Baum's column set out. As the Brunswickers marched, Patriot civilians fled in terror.
I can never forget, while anything of memory lives, my flight on horseback and in feeble health with my babe and 2 other small children, and my eldest daughter running along on foot by the side of me from Bennington to Williamstown, under circumstances of great alarm and fear from Hessians, Tory enemies, and Indians, and the absence of my husband at the time of this my trial for months before and for months afterwards.
After a few minor skirmishes on the outskirts of Bennington, Baum realized he faced a large enemy force. He sent a request for reinforcements, and Burgoyne dispatched Colonel Heinrich Bremen with 600 Brunswicker grenadiers and light infantry, but they wouldn't arrive for almost 2 days. Baum fortified a series of heights dominating a vital river crossing and waited. As word of Baum and Stark's standoff near Bennington spread, small groups of militia, both Loyalist and Patriot, flocked to the 2 forces. Several who entered Baum's camp were actually Stark's men, posing as Tories to collect information about the size and disposition of the enemy forces before slipping away to report what they'd learned. Warner's regiment marched south from Manchester in the rain, but the march took 2 days. Warner himself arrived in Bennington ahead of his regiment. John Stark was a brigadier general of New Hampshire militia. Seth Warner was a colonel in the Continental Army, and so was the ranking officer on the field. But he tactfully allowed the temperamental Stark to act in the role of commander. Baum's forces were entrenched on commanding heights, but so separated that mutual support would be impossible. Weak points were identified in some of the positions, and Stark and Warner concocted a plan to surround and attack all of Baum's posts at once. August 16th dawned sunny and warm. Stark's men marched through the woods, snaking around Baum's forces to their attack positions. An uneasy silence fell over the area. The assault began at the Brunswicker redoubt.
A violent volley of fire erupted against the entrenchment. Our dragoons fired volleys on the enemy in cold blood and with much courage, and it did not take them long to load their carbines behind their breastworks. But as soon as they rose to take aim, bullets went through their heads. They fell backwards and no longer moved a finger. Thus, in a short time, our tallest and best dragoons were sent to eternity. Our cannon shot balls and grape shot, sometimes to the right, sometimes to the left, and then again forward into the brush.
Across the river, The Loyalist redoubt was attacked with such force that in a matter of minutes the works were overrun.
The rebels pushed with a strong party on the front of the Loyalists where I commanded. As they were coming up, I observed a man fire at me, which I returned. He loaded again as he came up, and discharged again at me, and crying out, "Peters, you damned Tory, I have got you!" he rushed on me with his bayonet, which entered just below my left breast, but was turned by the bone. By this time I was loaded, and I saw that it was a rebel captain, Jeremiah Post, an old schoolfellow and playmate, and a cousin of my wife's. Though his bayonet was in my body, I felt regret at being obliged to destroy him.
The wounded Peters escaped. Most of the Loyalists were captured. The rest fled in the direction of the Brunswicker redoubt. But the Brunswickers were in desperate trouble.
The Germans fired by platoons and were soon hidden by smoke. Our men fired each on his own hook, aiming whenever he saw a flash. Few on our side had either bayonets or cartridges. Before I had time to fire many rounds, our men rushed over the breastwork.
There was hand-to-hand fighting. Colonel Baum and his dismounted dragoons drew their sabers and attempted to cut their way out. Baum was mortally wounded, and almost all of his men were killed or captured.
The enemy came rushing over our entrenchment, and 3 of them quickly took aim and fired at me. I fell to the ground behind the tree, and the bullets were dreadful, whistling over and beyond me. I remained lying on the ground until the enemy urged me rather impolitely to get up. One grabbed me by the arm, and another said he should kill me, whereupon he placed the bayonet of his gun with tightened trigger on my chest. He asked whether I was a Britisher or a Hessian. I told him I was a Braunschweig surgeon, shook hands with him, and called him my friend and brother. For what does one not do when in trouble?
Stark's militia saw to the hundreds of prisoners and wounded, and jubilantly collected battlefield trophies. But new sounds of battle were rising in the west. It was Bremen's relief column, making good progress against sporadic and disorganized resistance, and using their cannon to great effect. Some of the grape shot riddled a Virginia fence near me. One struck a white oak tree behind which I stood. Though it hit higher than my head, I fled from the tree, thinking it might be aimed at again. We skirmishers ran back till we met a large party of Stark's men, then faced about. But the enemy outflanked us, and I said to a comrade, "We must run or they will have us." He said, "I will have one more fire first." At that moment, a major on a black horse rode along behind us, shouting, "Fight on, boys! Reinforcements close by!" While he was yet speaking, a grape shot went through his horse's head and knocked out 2 teeth. It bled a good deal, but the major kept his seat and spurred on to encourage others. They advanced to within half a mile of the river crossing, when at the critical moment, Colonel Seth Warner's regiment arrived on the field. We saw Warner's men hurrying to help us. They opened right and left of us, and half of them attacked each flank of the enemy and beat back those who were just closing around us. Stark's men now took heart and stood their ground. Outnumbered 3-1, Warner's men threw themselves at the Brunswicker force and stopped them in their tracks. The militia increasingly joined in the fight. Warner's men worked around Bremen's flanks and nearly succeeded in encircling his force before descending darkness allowed them to escape. Baum and Bremen lost 4 cannon and more than 900 men. The Americans suffered some 70 casualties, but one of them was Seth Warner's brother. Warner rode near us. Someone, pointing to a dead man by the wayside, said to him, "Your brother is killed." "Is it Jesse?" asked Warner. And when the answer was yes, he jumped off his horse, stooped and gazed in the dead man's face, and then rode away without saying a word. For Burgoyne's army, it was a disaster. In addition to the huge loss in men, almost no supplies had been obtained. Some, notably the native warriors, viewed Bennington as a sign that the campaign was lost. But Burgoyne was a gambler. and he was about to go for broke. As summer turned to autumn, the British supply line stretched to the breaking point. Burgoyne cut his own supply lines and headed south toward Albany. The British attacked the American army at Saratoga and were fought to a standstill. In the meantime, huge numbers of American reinforcements arrived from every quarter. Warner's regiment and nearly 2,000 militia assembled at the town of Paulet, Vermont. They split into 3 columns and sliced into the British rear areas. One column struck the Brunswicker positions at Mount Independence to create a diversion.
We are besieging Mount Independence, and have been here 3 days all round them. We have lost 4 or 5 men. I have had but little sleep these 3 nights, for the roaring of cannon and crackling of guns are continually in our ears. I might say I felt ugly when I first heard the firing. I have had but 2 chances of firing my gun at the enemy. The cannonballs and grape shot rattle like hailstones.
While this was going on, another column hit Ticonderoga, taking hundreds of British prisoners and freeing over 100 American captives, among them many of those taken at Hubbardton. But they couldn't capture the fort and contented themselves to raid the British supply depots on Lake George. Burgoyne decided on one more roll of the dice at Saratoga and suffered a decisive defeat when General Benedict Arnold led a series of attacks that overwhelmed the British positions. General Simon Fraser was killed in the action, and General Arnold was wounded. The British army began to retreat to the north, but their path was blocked by the militia brigades of Generals John Stark and Jacob Bailey. A few small groups, including Colonel Peter's loyalists, escaped the trap through the woods to Canada. Burgoyne's army, with their food running out and little prospect of escape, surrendered on October 17th. Burgoyne's surrender was the turning point in the war. The achievements of the American army would have been impossible without the contribution of units from the Green Mountains. When the French heard of the surrender, they began negotiations that ended in a full military alliance with the United States and a declaration of war on Great Britain. French finance, weaponry, and materiel flowed into the American war effort. French armies and navies engaged British forces in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in India. In the years ahead, they would also become direct participants on the American continent. Great Britain would now have to prosecute the war in the American colonies while simultaneously defending all of its other holdings in a worldwide war. Never again would a large army attempt to capture and hold the northern frontier. Now it would be a war of raids and devastation. As perilous as the campaign season of 1777 had been, for the people of Vermont, the worst was yet to come.